I think the first time that I ever really thought about the American South in a substantive way was when I was taking a class in undergrad called Southern History and Literature. And we read the story A Rose for Emily by Faulkner, one of the most beloved Southern writers. A Rose for Emily, right, this is one of his most famous stories. It tells the story of a woman named Emily Grierson, and it's narrated by the gossip of the Southern community in which she lives. And it tells the story of her life and of the rather grotesque circumstances of her demise. And I'm gonna spare you the gory details because, Southern Gothic literature is not for everyone, and that's okay. But suffice it to say, it is a story about an awful truth about who a person really was finally being revealed after years of being hidden. And when I read it for the first time, I had an inkling that, something was happening under the surface of the text, but mostly I didn't get it, right? I didn't understand the symbolism. I didn't know what a lot of the words meant, and most of all, I didn't understand the South, right? Most of what I knew about the South at the time, I learned from going to a civil rights history summer camp with the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, because that's the kind of thing that I did growing up. And at Civil Rights History Summer Camp, we drove around to, Birmingham and Selma and Montgomery, and we learned all about the Civil Rights Movement and about the oppressive and unjust structures in the segregated South, and we learned all about the two Unitarian Universalists who had been killed for supporting the Civil Rights Movement. And so that I knew that, and I knew that the Civil War had happened and that the South had lost. So mostly I understood the South as a place that was backwards and scary, not to mention humid, as a place where people were oppressed and a place where Unitarians got killed. And I didn't think much more about it for years, not until watching the results rolling in of the presidential election of 2016. And I remember sitting there in my friend's living room watching Donald Trump get elected president and thinking, this is impossible, right? This simply isn't a thing that can happen, right? But there it was. It was happening, and this meant, I decided this meant that something was happening in my country that I didn't understand, that I couldn't comprehend. And I thought, well, then I need to go there. I need to go to Red State America, not to fix it or to save it, but to try and meet it and understand it better. Of the Unitarian Universalist churches that I agreed to second interviews with, almost all of them were in the South. And so I ended up here in Tennessee on a mission to relieve my own ignorance about what goes on in parts of the country that work very differently than the part of the country where I was raised. So this plan that I had, it has three major flaws. The first is that it is wildly condescending and presumptuous. The second is that it removed me from my surroundings in ways that I don't think you really can be in the South. When my wife Sandra and I moved here, the plan was to stay for a few years and then go home, right? And to feel satisfied that we had gone to an unfamiliar place and learned everything we needed to know in a few years, and then, go home and tell people about it at dinner parties. But the problem is that since we moved here, the South has become home. We've both fallen in love with the South and with Memphis in particular, and now we intend to stick around because the South is a beautiful place. Complicated though it may be, Southerners are awesome. Southerners are creative and interesting and stubborn and wild and thoroughly alive in a way that I have never seen before anywhere else. And I don't want to live my life surrounded by any other group of people. And so that leads us to the third flaw in the plan, which is that if I do plan on hanging out and, being a Southern minister who grew up in the North instead of being a Northern minister who spent some time in the South, then I do have to talk at least a little bit about the struggles and the realities of the part of the country that I'm in, right? I can't just sit and listen forever. I have to minister to the place where I am, and I know my Northern roots make my opinions about the South suspect, right? That's like a whole thing. A friend of mine from Boston told me to call him the first time somebody in Tennessee told me, we have a certain way of doing things around here that you wouldn't understand. But I think perhaps all communities sometimes need some outside eyes to give them a new perspective, especially if they are the eyes of a friend who loves you and who believes deeply in your inherent goodness. It's funny, I was talking with my clergy coach, who was my camp counselor at Civil Rights History Summer Camp all those years ago, and who is a lifelong Tennessean. And he said, look, the situation in the South really is more complicated than Northerners understand. And I said, I'm sure that's true, but also the situation in the South is less complicated than Southerners want to admit. And he said, yeah, that might also be true. But look, the situation in the South is complicated, but maybe even more than being complicated. It's also difficult and painful in ways that are very hard to talk about. And so I've been thinking about the South and how hard it can be to talk about some of the more troubling parts of Southern history. And I've been thinking about what I might offer to that conversation. And I keep thinking about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah from the Hebrew Bible. Stay with me. This probably isn't going where you think it's going. Sodom and Gomorrah, of course, are two cities that God destroys in the book of Genesis because they were inhospitable to God's angels. Sodom and Gomorrah, they exist kind of in our cultural vocabulary largely because of a misunderstanding of the text. There's a misunderstanding that implies that they were destroyed because of LGBTQ people who lived there. That's not a rabbit hole that I am going to go down this morning. I'm just going to tell you that's not what the text says. What happened in Sodom and Gomorrah in the book has nothing to do with LGBT people, and if you want to talk more about that with me, send me an email and I would be happy to set something up with you. Sodom and Gomorrah were cities, and what I always say about them is they were cities like any other cities. They had good people in them and they had harmful people in them, and a lot of people who were in between. The destruction of an entire city or region because it is filled with only wicked people is a very human and very short-sighted fantasy. If we want to tell the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in a useful way, then we have to say and acknowledge that Sodom and Gomorrah had artists and musicians living in them. Sodom and Gomorrah had young lovers sitting in windows. Sodom and Gomorrah had children running through the streets, and when the cities were destroyed, those people were there. But what I find interesting about Sodom and Gomorrah in this case is that the role that they play in the Bible is very similar to the role that the American South plays in our wider country, right? Both are looked at as places that are known for being deeply flawed. Both are places that get accused of all sorts of terrible things by people who don't live there, and some of those accusations are fair and some aren't. But both places are responsible for at least some of the things that they are blamed for, and both places were, at one point or another, horribly damaged in connection to the things that they were responsible for. Sodom and Gomorrah were damaged by the fire and brimstone that rained down upon them because of their sin of inhospitality, and the South, in the Civil War, was horribly damaged because of the institution of slavery, which is the greatest sin in the history of our country. And in both cases, the people who actually live there are generally ignored. That's why I've been thinking lately about the survivors of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the Bible says there were no survivors, but we are Unitarian Universalists. We can do what we want. And I think about these survivors, right? The people who were crawling through the wreckage of their ruined city and in shock and broken and weeping and trying to make sense of what had just happened. I've been thinking about these people and the choices that they had, and I've realized that the choices they've had are similar to the choices that the South had in post-Civil War America, right? And if the election of 2016 that shocked me so much, and the following years of insanity have taught us anything, it's that we are still living in post-Civil War America, right? And that the wound of our country's bloody war with itself has never fully healed. So, what can the citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah do? They can try to shift the blame, right? Or say, other cities were just as bad, and that's true. Old Testament God is not squeamish about destroying entire cities of people because they failed to be righteous enough. It happens a whole bunch of times. In a similar vein, the rest of the country has many of the same struggles as the South, and that includes some of the same difficult history, right? Right up until the start of the Civil War, there were a lot of Northerners, especially in New England where I am from, who made a lot of money in the textile business. And a lot of the cotton that they worked with was grown and picked by slaves in the South, right? And it needs to be said behind this pulpit, of all places, that a lot of those northern textile kings who were benefiting so greatly from slave labor, a lot of them were Unitarians, right? A lot of our huge, beautiful Unitarian churches in Boston were built with money that was made a couple steps removed, maybe, but money that was made through slavery, and that's real. The people in Sodom and Gomorrah could also deny what happened. They could say they weren't that inhospitable, that really people saying that they were inhospitable just don't understand what really happened, and they could rebrand the destruction of their city the war of godly aggression and bemoan the lost cause of Sodom and Gomorrah. They also have the option of doubling down, right? They can say they didn't need to be hospitable. They could say the angels in the city were better off when they were not being treated with hospitality in Sodom and Gomorrah. They could put up big, glorious statues of the people who were inhospitable to the angels. They could wave around the same flags that those people waved. All of these options lead nowhere good. They do not create healing because they do not acknowledge the truth. But surely there has to be a way for healing to happen, and for the Sodom and Gomorrah communities to move forward in a way that acknowledges the horrible parts of the past, but also leaves room for them to grow into the beautiful parts of their future. And the answer that I've got is a rose. One of the things that I didn't understand about A Rose for Emily the first time I read it was what the title of the story meant. William Faulkner gave A Rose for Emily its name because the story was an epitaph. It was a rose on the grave of a certain kind of Southern lifestyle that the character of Emily represented. The rose is an acknowledgement of what was, the parts of the past that were beautiful, and also the parts that were not nearly as beautiful as what we have been led to believe that they were, and the parts that were so completely horrible that we barely acknowledge them at all. The rose in the title of the story is a memorial to a dying person, but it is also a memorial to a dying lie. It is also a truth-telling and a letting go. And this is how we in the South need to acknowledge and process our history, if I'm allowed to say our history now. Our history that includes slavery, includes the army that was raised to protect slavery, our history that includes lynching and segregation and unjust laws and unequal treatment under the law. And these things are extra hard to talk about when you are the rest of the country's Sodom and Gomorrah, right? When everybody is looking at you and judging you and calling you violent and backwards, even though they are hardly any better. And the solution that I see to that is let them look. Let them see the South in all of its beauty and all of its damage. Our place of visibility is deeply uncomfortable, but it also gives us the opportunity to lead. Our flaws being so infamous gives us the chance to be a demonstration to the rest of the country, to the rest of the world, of how to face a difficult history. When I think about the survivors of Sodom and Gomorrah, sifting through the rubble and attempting to rebuild their lives, the first step, I think, is to start talking, is to acknowledge what was, the parts that were meaningful and beautiful and the parts that they aren't proud of. Sodom and Gomorrah had amazing food. Sodom and Gomorrah had beautiful, heartfelt music and plenty of loving, compassionate people, and that is part of their story. And they were inhospitable to the point of violence towards the angels who were amongst them. And that is also a part of their story and a part of what has made them who they are, and it needs to be talked about. And once they start talking, then they can begin to rebuild from a place of honesty, humility, and love. Amen.